So, welcome to I think this is the 6th of 10 Naturalist Nights. And as you know, this series is sponsored by 3 different organizations: the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies, the Wilderness Workshop, and the Roaring Fork Audubon. And this goes on for 10 weeks, so we have 3 more left after this, and they just continue to stay awesome. So keep coming back. And we have some new Audubon information over on the table that we haven't had the whole time this winter, so help yourself to any of the materials on the table, including the calendar. As you know, it takes a village to make this happen, and so all of these incredible sponsors we are so grateful for, especially tonight. The Euclid House is hosting our speakers, so we're grateful for that, and thank you, Kay. And also tonight, our featured sponsor is Cripple Creek Backcountry right here in Carbondale, so we're grateful to them for their sponsorship. And if you happen to know anybody else here on this slide, tell them thank you. Tonight, the cookies are from the Village Smithy. So, yeah. So Grassroots TV is obviously recording tonight's talk, and also is live streaming this on the Wilderness Workshop's Facebook page and ACE's Facebook page. And there's people from the Navajo Reservation in northern Arizona watching. There's people all over streaming these talks has become very successful and very broad-reaching. So if you're interested in seeing something you missed, we have all those videos on our websites as well as on social media. Also, we have continuing education credits available for educators. Make sure you sign the extra long clipboard over there. I'm happy to answer any questions regarding that. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'll tell you about next week. My friend and colleague, Dave Anderson, he's the director of the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, which is based at CSU in Fort Collins, will be coming over next week, and his presentation is titled "The Life and Times of Colorado, Our State's Natural History." And he's also going to share a bit of a local project that's happening in the next couple years here in the valley. So you'll want to be part of that. Tonight, we are also are in the midst of a CSU person from Colorado State University. We have Dr. Miranda Redmond, and she is the assistant professor, or is one of the many assistant professors there, where she teaches forest ecology. Her forest ecology research lab focuses on understanding the effects of climate and disturbances on forest dynamics so that as a society we can make more informed management decisions. The majority of her research is focused in Pinyon-Juniper woodlands in the southwestern United States, and she also works in subalpine forests in the southern Rocky Mountains and the Afromonte forests of South Africa. Before right now, we were discussing how much the Pinyon-Juniper forest kind of just doesn't get a whole lot of stories, and it doesn't get a whole lot of celebration, but we see it every single day, and you might even live in it. So tonight we dedicate Valentine's Day, Ash Wednesday, all of it to the Pinyon-Juniper forest.
All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for coming here this evening, and thanks, Sarah, and everyone else for inviting me. As Sarah mentioned, I'll be discussing kind of how Pinyon-Juniper woodlands are affected by recent changes in climate and different management actions. So a really romantic topic for this Valentine's Day. And let's see if I can click. Outline of this talk, I'll first be kind of introducing you all to Pinyon-Juniper ecosystems, why they're so amazing, make you fall in love with those ecosystems. I'll kind of briefly touch on some history of these woodlands and how the changes they've undergone in the past century. And then I'll discuss some more recent changes to Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, and specifically management actions as well as global climate change. So Pinyon-Juniper woodlands are a really spatially extensive vegetation type in the southwestern U.S. and especially in the Four Corners states and in Nevada. And they're dominated by pinyon trees, and there's several different pinyon species, as well as juniper trees, and there's also kind of multiple different juniper species. And in kind of the Four Corners states, the woodlands are really dominated by two-needle pinyon pine, and I'll be talking predominantly about those woodlands, but there are woodlands in Nevada that are dominated by single leaf pinyon, and I'll touch on those a little bit, but most of my research really focuses on two-needle pinyon pine. And this is a photo, I know you have pinyon-juniper woodlands in your backyard, but I wanted to give you a couple images just to show you kind of the diversity of these ecosystems. This is a photo of pinyon-juniper woodlands in the Great Basin, so in Nevada. Here's a photo taken at Mesa Verde National Park. You can see the really complex topography that these woodlands inhabit. Here's a photo near Canyonlands, Utah, of these woodlands. And one of the really neat things about these woodlands is they, particularly in the kind of Four Corners regions, and especially in a lot of Utah, they have these really unique biological soil crusts so that's the kind of blackish area, and these crusts really stabilize the soil. They add nutrients to the soil. They fix carbon, and they take multiple years to form. This crust is likely 200 years old, and it's made up of various different organisms. And pinyon-juniper woodlands also provide an array of ecosystem services. They're commonly grazed by cattle throughout the Southwest. And pinyon produces really prolific cone crops some years, and they have these highly nutritious seeds that are consumed by a wide array of wildlife species. So here's an image of a crossbill, actually in Browns Canyon near Salida, eating a pinyon pine seed. And here's an image of pinyon jay, which also consumes pinyon pine seeds, and their populations have been shown to really increase after the really big pinyon seed crop years, because they rely heavily on these seeds. And then the pine cones are also harvested by commercial pine nut harvesters. So if you're ever in Santa Fe, for example, in the fall, you'll see stands of pinyon seeds being sold. They're also really culturally important to a wide array of Native American tribes, and harvested each fall, often with kind of associated ceremonies, and then roasted in these kind of open pits. So that's kind of a really brief introduction to pinyon-juniper ecosystems and why they're so, kind of why we should care. Now I want to dive a little bit into kind of the history of these woodlands over the past century. And similar to many forested ecosystems throughout much of the western US, there has been documented kind of expansion and thickening of these woodlands throughout many areas, beginning in the early 1900s. So this is a photo, kind of repeat photography from Capulin Volcano National Monument in New Mexico. Here's another example taken at the City of Rocks in southern Idaho, so more at the kind of northern boundary of pinyon-juniper's range. And a lot of this kind of expansion and thickening that occurred in the early 1900s was attributed to grazing. So cattle prefer grasses over the kind of unpalatable tree needles. And so by eating grasses, they were able to reduce grass competition and allow pinyon and juniper trees to establish. And so that's kind of largely been the rationale that then resulted in a lot of historic treatments in pinyon-juniper woodlands. So yeah, and these treatments occurred because of that expansion and thickening that was thought to be predominantly due to human causes. And that thickening was associated with declines in understory plant cover and thought to have led to increases in soil erosion. And so this led to a lot of management actions in these woodlands. And one kind of really common activity that was done, particularly between the 1950s and 70s, was chaining, where they would, so this is an image of an Eli chain, which is like a 240-foot long chain that was dragged across these woodlands. It weighs about 23,000 pounds and literally dragged across to topple over the trees to reduce tree cover and increase understory plant cover. And these treatments really leave a lot of legacy effects in these woodlands. So I did a study with kind of several other people, and we found that areas that have been treated did have less tree cover 40 to 60 years after those treatments. They did have greater grass cover, which was a management goal, although that was predominantly due to crested wheatgrass, which is actually a non-native species that was seeded. And then those areas had less biological soil crust cover, as well as greater bare mineral soil cover, and less pinyon pine recruitment relative to juniper, suggesting that kind of down the road, those areas will be more juniper dominated for the next little while. And I'll get to why that is likely the case further on in this talk. And so these kind of treatment activities have occurred, management actions have occurred in 247,000 hectares of pinyon-juniper woodlands owned by the Bureau of Land Management in the Colorado Plateau, or the broader Colorado Plateau region. So here is Utah, here's southwestern Colorado, New Mexico, and northern Arizona. And that corresponds to about 6.6% of pinyon-juniper woodlands within BLM lands were treated. And the predominant method that was used was chaining. So that's all the green, and the pie charts were all kind of chaining and bulldozing type treatments. And as I mentioned, kind of the historic treatment rationale was largely because there's been this documented evidence of this expansion, and that it was thought to be really human caused due to grazing. And what we've been learning is that it's oftentimes due to natural reasons. So for example, in the early 1900s, there was a kind of multi-year wet period. And that's when a lot of tree establishment occurred. So these trees, they're right at the lower tree line, they're water stressed, and so establishment generally occurs during kind of cool, wet climate periods. And so the period when we saw that, expansion and infilling was, that establishment was occurring during that cool, wet climate period. And then in addition, there's also been kind of past logging in the 1800s. So in the Great Basin in particular, you'll, as you're walking around these woodlands, sometimes you'll come across these pile of dead wood, which were used, which is basically trees that were harvested in the kind of mid 1800s to make charcoal for the railroad. And so you might think that an area has gotten denser over the past century, but really it was just recovering from past logging. And so just kind of a couple take-home messages so far. Hopefully you, especially living in Carbondale and you see these woodlands, you have fallen in love, it's Valentine's Day, with Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. The other kind of point that I want to make is that, you know, the historical management of these woodlands to reduce pinyon trees, the rationale for it was not really consistent with our current knowledge of all the different drivers that have led to increases in tree densities. And so now I want to kind of dive into recent changes in Pinyon-Juniper ecosystems, both kind of in terms of management and how management goals have really shifted, as well as talking about climate change effects. And so this is a photo of a Pinyon-Juniper woodland that had burned in the early 2000s. And similar to kind of the early 2000s was a really dry period that prompted a lot of wildfires in the western US across many different ecosystem types, including in Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. Following this really prompted kind of national policy concerns to reduce the risk of these wildland fires, particularly right at the wildland-urban interface, so you know, next to homes because they're really economically costly. And another issue with Pinyon-Juniper woodlands and other forested types, you can also get this huge influx of invasive species after, especially cheatgrass. So this is an image of cheatgrass that really is a really good competitor in these dryland ecosystems, and also then kind of changes fire behavior and promotes fire spread into the future. So it's a really high management concern, especially because after they establish, it's really hard to get rid of cheatgrass. So current management goals are really to kind of reduce the risk of wildland fire, but then also, you know, increase native understory plant species cover and, you know, not lead to increases in non-native species, and also reduce soil erosion rates. And it's generally, they intentionally leave some live adult trees. Pinyon-Juniper woodlands aren't thinned like a lot of other forest types are. It's still very, like, large chunks are cleared, but they do try to leave these tree islands. And then there's also an array of fuel reduction treatment methods that are commonly employed in these woodlands. So, for example, this is a photo of one treatment method called which I'll be referring to as kind of the broadcast burn, where they cut down the trees and then burn the area during a cool period so it doesn't get out of control. Here's an image of kind of another treatment method, a pile burn, where basically they cut down the trees, put all the kind of woody material into piles, and then burn those piles. So, you know, part of the soil is unburned and just these distinct piles are burned. And then another treatment method is mastication, where basically you have a machine that picks up the trees, chips the wood, and then those wood chips get kind of spread out across the woodland floor. And so I want to spend kind of a little bit of time discussing some of the consequences of these treatment effects and how kind of effective they were at increasing understory plant cover of native species. And so I'll be discussing a study that we did in Utah, kind of right on the border, right on the Colorado border actually, and we looked at kind of these 3 different treatment methods, and also one of our goals was to assess whether it's necessary to seed with native understory plant species to get the kind of understory vegetation cover that's desired. And so, yeah, this study was done in kind of eastern Utah, literally right on the Colorado border. And here's here's kind of a broader map of this study region. And basically the area was done on this mesa top, and it was divided into these kind of 8 different blocks that experienced these different types of treatments. And some of the blocks experienced seeding, and some were left unseeded. And then we also had, a control, and then those 3 different treatments. And here's just kind of an image looking out. So this mountain, or this site is right near the La Salle's Mountains in Utah. So here's an image looking out on Ray Mesa at the La Salle Mountains. Really horrible place to do field work. Just kidding. And one thing that I want to kind of bring to your attention is this study was done, the treatments were done in 2010. And here's kind of an image of what one of the kind of understory, what the understory looked like in our control plots. And this was taken in 2010, kind of right when treatments occurred, or right prior to treatments. And then here's an image in 2012. So again, this is the control plot, not seeded, nothing happened. And I just want to point out that if we kind of toggle back and forth, see that understory vegetation really declined. And that's because, so before like 2010 and kind of leading up to it was a really wet year. And so understory vegetation was really lush. And then the treatments occurred and they were followed by a drought. So the control really declined. So the next graph I'll show is kind of the treatment responses. And so you'll see that there's this big decline in the control, and that's due to weather that managers can't control. And so, this is a graph showing kind of the percent change in herbaceous cover. And so you can see that kind of big decline in the control, and how and this is 2 years after that treatment, so in 2012. And you can see that some of the treatments had pretty large herbaceous cover responses. And what we really found was that seeding really strongly increased the herbaceous response. So these areas were likely seed limited in terms of getting that understory vegetation cover that's desired. And that the other kind of big finding is that both kind of mastication and broadcast burning seem to really produce the large understory vegetation response that was desired. But that graph was just total understory vegetation cover. It wasn't native versus non-native. And so this is showing the relative cover of invasive species. Because again, they were really wanting to get those native understory vegetation species. And the main thing I want to point out is how high the invasive species cover was in that broadcast burn. And this was really predominantly due to invasive annual forbs. So we didn't see a big cheatgrass response, which was really great. And here's just to kind of visualize the treatment effects. Here's a photo of kind of one area of the mastication treatment. Here's a photo of the broadcast burn, and you can see those invasive annual forbs. And then here's a photo of the pile burn that just didn't have quite as lush or quite as much of an understory vegetation response, but also didn't have that invasive species response. But one thing that I wanted to mention is that actually in kind of another study site where we were able to go back, where they went back 6 years after treatment, so kind of longer term study, they actually found that cheatgrass invasion, even though it hadn't been pronounced 2 years after, was really high 6 years post-treatment in kind of the unseeded mastication treatment. So I'm bringing this up in the context of it's really important to do long-term monitoring, because sometimes you won't immediately get the response the kind of the long-term response, and invasive species can establish multiple years after treatments. And then these treatments also really strongly influence wildlife, and with some species that are, really dependent upon pinyon-juniper trees for habitat and forage declining, but then other species responding positively. So it has really mixed responses in terms of wildlife. There was one kind of recent paper that came out that really found that over the short term, these treatments are having kind of negative or neutral, but not positive effects on birds and small mammals. But that might be because it takes time for the shrubs to come back, which wildlife species can depend on. But what is really clear is that some species lose, there's kind of losers and winners with these types of treatments that are going on in these pinyon-juniper woodlands. And so just to summarize, treatments generally increase understory vegetation cover, which is a desired kind of management goal, both in terms of kind of having the understory vegetation cover present to increase resilience to exotic species coming in and taking over. And seeding following treatment appears to be really important in reducing non-native invasive species establishment. And these treatments also really produce kind of mixed effects on wildlife, with some wildlife species kind of benefiting and others, especially like the pinyon jays, really not benefiting. But then long-term monitoring is really important to really figure out the long-term implications of these kind of treatments that are really actively being done in these woodlands. So now I want to kind of totally switch gears and talk about some climate change impacts that have been happening in pinyon-juniper woodlands that haven't really been pronounced here in this part of the state, but has been pronounced in a lot of the southwestern US, including just in kind of the Mesa Verde National Park area, as well as in northern Arizona and New Mexico. And so kind of across globally, we're seeing a lot of tree mortality due to what's called hotter droughts. So basically, these years of low precipitation that also have warmer temperatures that make the water that is available in the soil evaporate more, make the trees transpire more, and really just increase tree water stress. And so these hotter droughts have led to kind of global trends in tree mortality. And pinyon-juniper, and pinyon pine has been had really high levels of mortality in the early 2000s due to a multi-year hotter drought. I don't know if you all remember that time period, but it was dry and hot. And so here's a map showing kind of the spatial extent of pinyon-juniper woodlands, and the red is all the kind of pinyon pine mortality areas. So again, kind of that southwestern Colorado was really heavily hit. Portions of New Mexico was also really heavily hit, as well as Arizona. Utah seemed pretty unscathed. And here's just a photo of what that mortality looks like. So this was taken in the Jemez Mountains, so in northern New Mexico. And all of this red, these are all pinyon trees that were dead the next year. So this photo was taken in 2003. The next year, they were all gray. So this was kind of upwards of 90% pinyon pine mortality, really high here's another image of taken in New Mexico, and north central New Mexico, and all that gray is all dead pinyon pine trees that died due to that multi-year drought. And here's kind of an image that I took from just outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and again, you can just see these dead pinyon trees. And just to kind of bring home the point, one of my first projects in Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, I wanted to look at, okay, I've read about all this mortality. I want to see, I'm really interested in, are these woodlands going to come back? Are these trees going to make it again? So I had what I felt like this robust sampling design where I was going to sample these kind of low mortality and high mortality areas. So I drove down to southwestern Colorado and drove a lot longer than I thought because it was so hard to find low mortality areas. And my grad student, one of my graduate students this past summer was doing fieldwork in kind of Colorado and New Mexico, and he just needed to find kind of 8 adult pinyon trees and like for his sites, and had the hardest time in New Mexico because that's how severe that mortality was. So here I'm driving like, oh, these trees look awesome. But it's really different in kind of that part of the world. And in a study that was done in New Mexico recently found that this tree mortality actually then further exasperates water stress, because when the leaves fall from the tree, there's a lot more solar radiation coming down, which is increasing evaporation rates. This was done in just one area that's dominated by monsoonal precipitation, so the effects are probably a lot more pronounced, but it does really highlight how these mortality events might really reduce the resilience of these woodlands to kind of further climate warming and projected increases in drought. So kind of a really kind of central question to a lot of my research is, should we be concerned about declines in pinyon and or juniper populations, although I mostly focus on pinyon, given predicted increases in temperatures and recent mortality events? And where on the landscape should we be concerned? And what are the bottlenecks to getting those trees to regenerate after that mortality? So in other words, these landscapes that have undergone really dramatic change, what are they going to become in the future? And so I'm going to be presenting kind of various kind of components of my research that's started to address this question. And if we think about what are these woodlands going to be like in the future, it's important to remember that there's kind of multiple different steps that are required in order to get kind of a reproductively mature, healthy Pinyon-Juniper woodland. So first, you need sufficient seed availability. And if you have sufficient seeds, those seeds must be able to germinate and establish to have these juveniles on the landscape. And those, through continued growth and survival, do you have those kind of mature pinyon pines that hopefully are then reproducing seeds. And so I'm first going to talk about some work that I did looking at kind of seed production and how it's changed from kind of the 1970s to today. And this is a project that I did actually as a graduate student in collaboration with my PhD advisor, Nicole Barger, and someone who now works for the USDA ARS, Frank Forcella, and doesn't work in Pinyon-Juniper woodlands anymore, but did his dissertation work in the 70s on pinyon pine comb production. And so I basically went out to these sites and resampled them to see how they changed from when he did his study to today. And this is actually my first project in graduate school. Got in the car, drove to these sites. all across New Mexico and kind of the very northwestern part of Oklahoma, and recruited my mom to help me collect some pine branches to measure for cone production. And used this really unique, really neat methodology that Frank Forcella had used in the past, where basically we're able to reconstruct cone production going back about 15 years by, because trees, on tree branches, they kind of leave the history right there for you to look at. And so this kind of right here is an annual whirl. So basically it's marking a new year. And then this right here is another annual whirl. And then these branches also leave behind these cone scars. So here's a cone scar of a 2014 cone. Here's a cone scar of a 2009 cone. So you can go back, and it does a really phenomenal job at reconstructing past cone production. And so I was able to reconstruct past cone production from 2003 to 2012, and Frank Forcella had reconstructed it from 1969 to 1978. So we had kind of these two different decades to really compare how cone production has changed. And so this is kind of a map or a graph showing how temperature and precipitation has changed on average across the study areas where we sampled. And I just want to point out that when Frank Forcella had sampled, so for his dissertation research, which I'm referring to as the 1974 decade, it was a lot cooler, so that black line is temperature, than when I sampled, so in the 2008 decade. So you can see that temperature has really increased a lot from when he sampled to when I sampled. Just as a caveat, if I showed you a longer temperature graph, it wouldn't be nearly as pronounced. So don't be totally alarmed. But I'm just showing you this because in terms of my sampling, it was really cool when he sampled and really hot when I sampled. And if we look at how cone production's changed during these two time periods, we found that, on average across these sites, there's about a 40% decline in cone production But one thing that I want to point out is that this decline in cone production is among live trees only. So there's been a lot of mortality, and so that would be even greater declines. But this is just among live trees because we were really interested of the trees that are present, how has cone production changed? And this really, suggests that climate and projected continued increases in temperature will likely continue to negatively impact pinyon cone production. And kind of to further support this, when we look at, okay, well, what years did they produce those really high seed crops? Because pinyon is a species, it's a masting species, meaning pretty much all the trees in a stand will produce seeds all at once, one year, and then not for many years. And so what we found is those years when they had those really high cone crops, late summer temperatures, which is actually the time when cones are initiated, were generally cool. So they're producing those cone crops during, cool late summer temperatures, and they're not having many cone crops during warm late summer temperatures. So this, really suggests that temperatures might negatively impact seed cone production. So if we go back to our conceptual diagram here, seed production might be a bottleneck to pinyon regeneration in the future. And this also has really important implications for wildlife species. So pinyon jay, for example, has been declining over the past 40 years. And this may partially explain those declines.
What is that cool temperature for the range for the cool that they prefer?
Yeah, in August. That's a really great question, and it really depends on the site because they vary so much in terms of elevation. But that's an excellent question. Yeah, depend on where you are. And I should have just like grabbed some pine branches in Carbondale and I could have showed you guys when we're big cone years, but I didn't. Okay, so next I just want to kind of briefly discuss some research that I've been doing looking at, you know, in those areas that we're seeing these high levels of mortality, are we seeing juveniles coming back? You know, is it going to be pinyon dominated in the future, or are we going to be, does it look like we're losing our pinyon trees? And so this is some work that I did kind of really with the aim to sample across a lot of the distribution of two-needle pinyon pine. And so I sampled sites in southwestern Colorado, in Arizona, as well as in New Mexico. And kind of the main result, some sites in areas with high mortality, there was not much pinyon regeneration. But in other sites, there actually was quite a bit. So yeah, so here's kind of a young pinyon juvenile, and you know, in the wake of all this mortality, that looks really healthy. And here's another image of yeah, of the site that had, you know, pretty abundant pinyon juveniles, looking like, okay, this woodland seems like it's going to bounce back after that mortality event. And so what we found was that there was this high variability, with some sites showing little to no regeneration and some sites showing pretty healthy regeneration. And it was really driven by kind of water availability. So sites that generally received less precipitation, so you know, you could think of that as low elevation sites, more arid sites, had less pinyon pine recruitment, as well as sites that had a low soil available water capacity. So, you know, super sandy soils that don't hold water well were less likely to have pinyon regeneration, you know, compared to the sites with more precipitation or high soil available water capacity. And then we also found that to have a lot of recruitment, particularly kind of new seedling establishment after that mortality, you needed to have reproductively mature trees. So that seed source needed to be present. And then we also found that you had to have that generally high tree cover was really strongly associated with, so high pinyon and juniper tree cover was really strongly associated with pinyon recruitment. And I'll get to kind of why that is in a second. And kind of similarly, grass cover also really drove pinyon recruitment, likely due to the competitive effects of grasses. So if we have our kind of tree, our dead overstory tree, that's going to impact regeneration by reducing seed availability. And that in turn would then negatively impact the likelihood of finding a pinyon tree. But those dead trees also reduce tree cover. So once a tree dies, you have lower tree cover, and that then negatively impacts pinyon recruitment. And the reason why is that pinyon pine is really commonly, commonly requires these nurse plants to basically help facilitate their establishment and survival. So if you're walking in a Pinyon-Juniper woodland, next time you walk around, look and see where the juveniles are. Most often, I'm going to say it's like 9 times out of 10, they'll be beneath a tree, or this is a little sagebrush. So they'll kind of establish in these little nooks. And I should mention that, you know, this tree very well could be 50 years old. They're really slow growing. Yeah, they're very slow growing trees, but so especially kind of when they're younger, they have much higher survival underneath the canopy of trees and shrubs because generally water stress is lower underneath those canopies. But then, okay, so then, you know, tree mortality is going to reduce tree cover, which negatively impacts pinyon recruitment. But it also can lead to increases in grass cover. And grasses compete with pinyons, so that would then negatively impact pinyon recruitment. And to kind of show you an example of this, this is a photo taken actually in the Great Basin following chaining treatments, or following a prescribed fire that was done. And this is 30 years later. And the border of the prescribed fire is right here. And there are some little trees, but those are all junipers. Pinyon really poorly establishes if there aren't those nurse plants, and they're poor competitors with grasses. And so that's kind of why we're seeing this effect. And then, as I mentioned, water availability, specifically precipitation and soil, kind of soil type, really strongly influences pinyon recruitment, but it also really influences pinyon mortality. And so it's likely one of the reasons why here in Carbondale you're not seeing a ton of pinyon mortality relative to other much more arid regions that pinyon pine occupies. So to summarize, there's been extensive pinyon pine mortality due to a multi-year drought. And the declines in pinyon pine cone, and we have been seeing kind of also big declines in pinyon pine cone production that are associated with warmer temperatures. These are just associations. We don't actually know the mechanism of it, and it's definitely still a very active area of research. And then we're also kind of our recruitment work and looking at, you know, is pinyon pine coming back, suggests that in some areas we might actually see a shift in woodland structure and composition to kind of a more juniper dominated, perhaps more savanna type ecosystem in the future, with the caveat that you know, we've only had 10 to 15 years to really look at that regeneration response. And so if we think of kind of the effects of this drought-induced tree mortality, one thing that I didn't mention is that it can also really strongly, or I only briefly mentioned that it can really strongly affect the understory vegetation. And this has been a pretty understudied topic, the understory vegetation response. You know, so are you going to get, after these trees die, are you going to get a novel ecosystem dominated by invasive species? Is it going to become a native grassland? Is it going to be, you know, more sagebrush dominated, sagebrush steppe vegetation type? Or is it just going to be barren? And that understory vegetation response is really going to strongly influence the overstory vegetation response as well. And so, yeah, I think, so yeah, there's just a lot of uncertainty in that understory vegetation response. That's really important in thinking about how these woodlands are going to recover. So, kind of some final summary take-home messages. The historical management to reduce pinyon-juniper woodlands was really not, the rationale was really not always consistent with our kind of current knowledge of those ecosystem dynamics and how their populations fluctuate over time with longer term changes in climate as well as past land use. Current climate conditions have resulted in large tree mortality events that are projected to continue. Pinyon-juniper recovery to this mortality is really highly variable across the landscape. You know, there were areas that had these beautiful looking juvenile pinyon trees, and then other areas that had basically none. And I think the kind of really big question that I don't have an answer for is how should we move forward with management in these woodlands? So there's, managing for native understory resilience. A lot of the kind of current Pinyon-Juniper removal treatments are, really one of their big goals is managing for the understory resilience and preventing influx of these cheatgrass and other invasive species. But then we also really need to think about tree resilience, and we're seeing a ton of pinyon pine mortality. Should we be then removing pinyon pine trees in areas? Can these two objectives be met simultaneously, and how so? And I think this is kind of a challenging question to ask, but I think a question that really needs to be asked that isn't really being asked often enough at this point in time. So with that, I just want to acknowledge some key collaborators that, on various different projects that I discussed, as well as several funding sources and many, many amazing field and lab assistants and kind of science collaborators that aren't explicitly listed. And then I would love to take any questions.
Question for you. Talk loud? Okay. So the mortality that you were showing in southwestern Colorado that came at the turn of the new millennium, or however you want to state that, was that from trees and forests drying out, or was that the Ips beetle coming through, or what caused that mortality?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and one that I didn't at all discuss. So it is considered to be primarily caused by that multi-year drought, but the pinyon Ips beetle was really active. So pinyon Ips beetle is a bark beetle, and it was really active during that period. So it definitely exacerbated that mortality event. So it was a combination of drought and the Ips beetle. Ips beetle alone wouldn't have killed the tree. There are some areas where there is no Ips beetle evidence that did have mortality, but the vast majority of areas had both Ips beetle and drought. So great question.
Are there deer populations in these forests, and how do the deer impact these little trees?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so there are a lot of deer populations in these forests. Mule deer is common in Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. And in terms of the trees, I haven't seen any studies that have looked at that, but I don't think they really strongly negatively affect the trees. I do actually, in the fuel reduction treatment study that we did, where we looked at those different treatment methods and the understory vegetation response, we actually had set up these wildlife exclosure treatments, and we don't know if it was deer or rabbits or what the wildlife species was, but in the wildlife exclosures there was about 40% more understory vegetation cover. So the wildlife populations definitely do impact the understory vegetation species. The trees, at the early stages it could, but it's not like aspen where pinyon needles aren't very palatable. If you eat a pinyon needle, it's has a lot of tannins. It's not very tasty. So I don't want to say they don't have any impact, but I don't think they have a very large impact.
I was wondering where you see the most active treatment, and what the justification is, where geographically and what the reason is.
Yeah, so I would say in a lot of the Great Basin I'd say that area has been the most active in terms of treatments. So in Nevada in particular, there's been, actually, and I've heard in Utah as well, there's been a lot of treatments that have been going on. One of the big justifications that I had meant to mention so sage grouse is a native bird species that relies heavily on sagebrush, and the kind of increase in pinyon-juniper trees is thought to reduce sagebrush cover. And so one of the big rationales for the treatments is to increase sage grouse habitat. And that's a threatened species that is of high management concern. The other rationale that I think is like, I guess to me is a bigger reason to do the treatments, although I'm not saying we should or shouldn't. But the other rationale is wildfires are predicted to become more common as temperatures warm. And if we have a big wildfire come through and then it all gets dominated by tree grass, we're going to lose our trees anyways. So is there a way to kind of reduce the likelihood of that happening while maintaining tree resilience? And I think one question is, we're spending a lot of money on these treatments, and if it's possible to perhaps instead focus on post-wildfire treatment response and really just manage woodlands, do those treatments right at the WUI and not in other areas. Could be a good option, but yeah, great question.
I had a question about prescribed burns.
It's recording your voice.
Oh, okay. So my name is Stacy. I have a question about the prescribed burns and why are there more prescribed burns in Vernon? Like I don't know what the motivation is for prescribed burns, just to like clear out the area, but why Vernon? I noticed that was a big area.
So great question. I have no idea. Yeah. It might be that I'm not sure if this is the case, but it could be that they were treating more kind of lower elevation areas that weren't as densely treed. So prescribed burning was more easier to do. Actually, the most likely explanation is that area just more recently was doing treatment. So that pie chart I was showing was treatments from 1950s to 2003. And really like the chaining was predominantly the 1950s through the 70s. And then more recently is when they've started to do these other management actions. So it could be that Vernon didn't do a ton in the past and it's more recent.
Two more questions.
Okay, I understand they're wanting to get rid of some of these pinyon trees and juniper trees, but wouldn't the benefit of them with the protection for the wildlife against predators and possibly some food habitat be more beneficial than trying to invase to get rid of the trees? Is that, or am I know that we're concerned about the burn, the feeding into a fire, but I don't really understand why we really want to get rid of all of them.
Yeah. So I guess one thing just to state, I don't want to get rid of all of them. I love pinyon and juniper trees, and I think so. Some of those wildlife studies have all really recently come out, and I'm hoping that it really brings forward to the point that there are losers in these treatments, and yeah, I think just some. Yeah, there's kind of trade-offs in treating and not treating, and the kind of treating ones have won so far in terms of managers' concerns, but I think we're learning what some of the other consequences are that might kind of flip that scale.
I know you're a PJ expert and not a sagebrush expert, but I know that the Pinyon-Juniper ecosystems around here have a lot of sage, and I'm wondering, what have you noticed about the sagebrush regeneration maybe further south? And maybe you said something, I might have missed it, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, great question. And to be honest, sagebrush is of really high management concern, and I am not sure how, in the recent decade, I'm not sure how sagebrush has responded over time. My understanding is that it's been declining, but I'm not Don't quote me on it.
Okay, we'll have one more. Katie, we'll keep going. These are really good questions.
I was just curious, what does a healthy soil profile look like in a PJ forest? In my experience, it's typically very barren mineral soil. I've never, to my recollection, walked through and said, wow, this is some good, healthy soil.
Yeah, really good question. So the healthy soil are those soil crusts. And it's really, so a lot of areas don't have them because, and I didn't mention this, but they're really easy to destroy. So there's this like saying, for example, if you go to Canyonlands, you'll see signs that saying don't bust the crusts, because if you walk on them one time, especially if it's wet, they will likely recover, but like especially repeatedly, or if it's really dry, they aren't able to recover and they take years and years. There's 200-year-old kind of soil crust communities. And so a lot of the soils have been degraded by cattle grazing that happened in these woodlands that has really reduced the prevalence of these soil crusts.
Are they microbiotic or macrobiotic?
So it's say microbiotic. So it's like a combination of there's a lot of cyanobacteria, lichin, some algae, kind of a wide array of different microorganisms that form, and the microorganisms that actually change over time. So the like really dark colored profuse crusts are, especially with like the little bit of gray at top, are some of the like older crusts. But then there's crusts that do have kind of a different suite of microorganisms that are newer crusts. So it's kind of like after fire in a forest, you might see certain plant communities that then kind of change over time. It's similar in those crusts.
So I just want to add a plug for cryptobiotic crust. If you come back on March 7th, another amazing Colorado Plateau ecologist is coming to speak here, Dr. Jane Belknap, and I have a feeling she's going to spend a lot of time, well, she will talk about cryptobiotic soil, I would have to imagine, but she's coming in a few weeks, so it's really cool to have these complimentary talks.
Yeah, and she's part of this really big kind of crust restoration project at looking at how can we restore these soil crusts on degraded lands. I don't know if that's what she'll be talking about, but she will be able to answer crust questions way better than I will.
So I know that Miranda's happy to stick around and have further conversations, so please come ask her some questions, and happy Valentine's Day, and thanks for being here this evening.